This is Rust in Production, a podcast about companies who use Rust to shape the future of infrastructure. My name is Matthias Endler from Corode, and today we talk to Brendan Abolivier from MZLA about integrating Rust into Thunderbird. Brendan, welcome to the show. Can you quickly say a few words about yourself and about Thunderbird, the project that you work on?
Sure, thanks for having me. So my name is Brendan Abolivier. I'm a software engineer at MZLA working on Thunderbirds, mostly kind of on the back-end side of the desktop application, so everything around storage, protocol implementation, this kind of stuff.
Amazing. And I learned that you know multiple languages. You don't only know Rust. What other languages do you commonly use?
Yeah, I mean, throughout my career so far, I've come across a few. I've done some projects in Go. Python was the main language I used at a previous job. I've done some C++ and JavaScript around Thunderbird, and now I'm kind of playing around with Rust a bit.
Before you started working on Thunderbird, you were at Element, I assume, and you worked on the matrix.org backend. Can you just briefly describe your work there?
Yeah, so I was part of the kind of backend team at Element, so working on a kind of backend implementations for Matrix. So that involves Synapse, which is currently the main Matrix home server implementation out there, written in Python. Also some other bits, identity server, push notification gateways, and also did some commercial projects in Python and Go within Element as well.
Was there any Rust?
There was a bit of Rust. There was like one commercial project that we started within the kind of last few months from my time at Element, and it was less hands-on and more like prototypey kind of stuff. Not really as, I guess, advanced and heads-on as the stuff that I'm currently working on now.
Yeah, and now you work on Thunderbird. When did you join the team?
So I joined in June of 2023. Yeah, the story is actually interesting. I went to... So there's an open source conference here in London where I live, which is called State of Open, that started last year, had its first edition last year. It's organized by Open UK, which is a big collective based in the UK, organizing meetups and actions around open source in the country. And they had a thing in place where if you were unemployed, you could reach out to them for a free ticket to the conference. And at that time, I had been laid off by Element, I think a month or two before. So I went there, and they had a job board, and one of the jobs listed there was to work at Mozilla on Thunderbird. And so I applied, and a few months down the line, after a bit of waiting and a few interviews, I got it.
Amazing. I assume you knew Thunderbird before and probably you used it as well. What got you interested in working on Thunderbird itself?
Yeah, I mean, I've been like, that's kind of one of the exciting parts of the job. I've been using Thunderbird for as long as I can remember. I think probably 10, 15 years, which also means in a kind of scary way that I've been using Thunderbird for close to half of my life, which is unsettling. And so, yeah, I mean, Mozilla has been for a long time a company and a community and a project that I looked up to. And, Thunderbird is something that I use on a daily basis, and I have used on a daily basis for years. And so when I saw the listing, I thought might as well apply and see where it leads.
The Thunderbird project itself underwent some restructuring, and there were some rough years for sure. Can you just briefly walk us through the history of the project?
Yeah, so around 2012, 2013, Mozilla announced that Thunderbird was being put on maintenance modes, which meant that although some aspects of the project still lived at Mozilla, the actual development and maintenance of the app was handed over to the community. And so that lasted from 2012 to a bit after, I think, 2017. Around 2017, the Mozilla Foundation, working together with the community, the Thunderbird community, started trying to infuse some life into that project. They started hiring a few people and helping the community through their fundraising work. And that experiment paid off. In 2020, the kind of ship had picked up wind in itself, and so Mozilla started a brand new subsidiary called MZLA, which is dedicated to Thunderbird, to developing and maintaining Thunderbird, and also potentially creating other projects and products around email and calendaring. And that's kind of where we are now. Nowadays, Thunderbird employs a bit over 30 people full time. We're currently the project is still funded entirely by donations. We raised $6.8 million in 2022. I'm not sure I can speak on the actual number for 2023, but it's more than that. So yeah, the project is going really well, which is good to see. As a user, I was a bit sad to see that Thunderbird was going through a rough time, and it's good to see it going through this revival and also being part of that.
I've been a Thunderbird user for an equally long time as you. Can still remember that 10-15 years for sure. 10-15 years ago, I used Thunderbird, and I used it for many years on different operating systems. It always worked surprisingly well. After a while, I kind of moved on to Apple Mail, and that was mostly because of the internal turmoil, and there were some issues with, the overall user experience. But 2 years ago, I picked up Thunderbird again because I saw a shift in momentum. It was really transformative. And I downloaded application, and I have never looked back ever since. I kind of tossed Apple Mail into the trash, and now I'm a full-time Thunderbird user, and I couldn't be more happier. But I wonder, for me, it always worked fine, at least the last couple of years, and even before that, I didn't really run into a lot of bugs. And moving a big legacy application from C++ to Rust can be a risky endeavor. What do you think about that?
So, first thing I want to clarify, we're currently not, planning to rewrite the entirety of Thunderbird into Rust. Rust in Thunderbird is still very early stages. We started, actually the patch in Thunderbird to even enable building Rust, I think, landed towards the end of December, and the first actual Rust codes landed just a few weeks ago. So it's still very early stages, and for now we're kind of focusing on using Rust for new components. Maybe as the time goes, we'll need to rewrite some big parts of our current code architecture. And in this case, we might use Rust for that.
Yeah, nonetheless, migrating to a new language is always a bit risky, at least. And how does Rust fit into Thunderbird's long-term strategy?
So the reason Rust came into the picture is because we're currently working on implementing support for Microsoft Exchange in Thunderbirds. That's the first time that we're implementing a new protocol in Thunderbird since its lifetime, really, since it grew out of Netscape Communicator 20-25 plus years ago. And so when we started these projects, we realized that we didn't know how to implement the protocol, and obviously because all that previous work had been done so long ago, we didn't have all that institutional knowledge around anymore. And so we started by looking through the code, surveying a bit what's already there, and we realized that the way the protocols are implemented currently, it's fine, it works, but it's not how you would implement a new protocol right now. It's how you would implement a protocol 20, 25 years ago. Now we have better tools and platforms to implement something as critical and sensitive as protocol support for an email for email, because email is very sensitive. You don't want to mess with the actual data that's transmitted. You don't want to mess with the structure of that data, misrepresent anything. Rust provides us with some very nice guarantees in terms of memory safety, in terms of typing, in terms of all those kind of things that we need that weren't around 20 years ago. So that's kind of how it fits into our current strategy. And also, another obvious point of why we're using Rust is because Thunderbird is built on top of Firefox at the moment. And so Firefox has Rust codes in its code base. And so a lot of the necessary infrastructure in the build system, in the CI system, etc., already supports Rust. So even though we did have to do some work to be able to have our own Rust code in Thunderbird, it also meant that it wasn't something that we had to start from scratch. And so it was easier than just going with another platform. So in terms of the long-term strategy, it's not entirely clear yet, what will be written in Rust, what won't be written in Rust. It's clear that Rust will still be used to develop new things that are new components that needs the kind of guarantees that Rust provides. We might, as I mentioned earlier, we might use it to rewrite existing components if we feel like there's value to it. It's not that clear cut yet what will end up being Rust, what won't.
Can you imagine that some new components will be written in C++?
At the moment, possibly. There's, well, at least with some C++ in it, there's the way things currently work in terms of something called XPCOM in Thunderbird and Firefox, which is kind of that interface layer between languages. It stands for cross-platform component object model. The idea is basically that you define some interfaces in kind of platform neutral language called XPIDL for cross-platform interface definition language, I think. And you can then implement and use implementations of those interfaces in JavaScript, C++, Rust. The bindings for XPCOM in Rust are still fairly, I don't want to say immature, but they lack that extra. They still feel a bit rough to use at the moment, and there are still some features around memory management, around pointers, around references, and so on that aren't supported or unsupported well. And so for that, we might need to shift a bit more into the land of C++. That might improve. That situation might be improved in the future. We hope so, and we'll probably work with the XPCOM team to try to make things better. but it's likely that at least at first we will still have some C++ in our new components, even though the majority will be written in Rust.
As far as I remember, you said somewhat like 30 developers work on Rust more or less regularly.
Yep.
How many of them work with Rust code or will deal with Rust on a regular basis in the future?
So at the moment, we're about 3 people dealing with Rust, because that's the size of the developer, the amount of developers in the team working on implementing Exchange. The current backend team at the moment, I think, is about 5 or 6 people. I might be wrong on that, but I think it's about that scale. And those people might have to deal with Rust in terms of writing code for it.
And earlier you mentioned tooling was one of the big advantages of Rust. A lot of people mention stability and robustness and maybe performance, but you mentioned tooling, which I find interesting. First of all, why do you think this is the biggest benefit of Rust? And second, maybe can you talk about the tooling that you mean specifically?
I mean, so yeah, when I say tooling, I mean the tooling that already exists in Firefox, meaning that there's currently tools and infrastructure in place in Firefox to build Rust codes. When you build Firefox and by extension Thunderbird, there's already code in place to generate bindings for XPCOM interfaces in Rust, and to interact with those bindings, to define components in Rust. There's already some amount of documentations on the Firefox side on how to use Rust to interact with the rest of Firefox. So yeah, when I mentioned tooling, I meant more tooling specific for Firefox, which is helpful to us because we're based on, Thunderbird is based on Firefox. So if Firefox already has some infrastructure for building and using Rust, it's something that we can use as well.
It probably also helps that Rust has a similar memory layout, C++, and also uses a similar build system, or at least the binaries that it produces are similar with respect to, name mangling and all of these details that you have to deal with on an FFI basis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't be able to give you, more details, that Mozilla has, a dedicated team to take care of the build system in Firefox. So I don't have all the, nitty gritty details. I do know that the way the build system works is by, linking, linking or Rust symbols on a more generic library, and so having that kind of compatibility definitely, it is definitely helpful.
When you said that you are using somewhat of the same code base as Firefox, my immediate thought was, do you also use the Rust code in Firefox to some extent? I know that they worked on CSS and layout engines, and at least in Thunderbird you can show HTML emails. Do you share some parts of that code, or is it completely separate?
I think we do use some of the Rust code from Firefox kind of indirectly, because we use some of the components from Firefox in Thunderbirds. The entire, rendering engine, front-end engine, all that stuff is directly lifted from Firefox. The networking engine is the same as Firefox. So I'm not entirely, obviously familiar with the Firefox code base, not as well. I'm somewhat familiar with some parts of it, but definitely not as much as, a Firefox developer would be. But I don't know which parts of the components that we use are in Rust. I know that there's definitely some C++ there. There's probably some Rust there. I wouldn't be able to give you an exact kind of split of what is Rust or Redis C++. But there's definitely a mix there.
And maybe looking at it from the other perspective, how often do you have to deal with the C++ intricacies on a daily basis?
It really very much varies depending on what I'm currently working on. At the moment I'm mostly working on Microsoft Exchange. So when we need to work through implementations and stuff like that, it's going to be a majority of Rust. When it's the initial kind of survey work that I mentioned, it's going to be majority of C++ because the existing code that we need to survey and understand is written in C++. We probably will have to write some amount of C++ for Exchange. So far, I haven't been working on a part of that project that involves doing that. I know that one of my coworkers, Sean, has had to look into that, but I don't necessarily have the details on that. But I mean, outside of that, main project that I'm currently working on, when I investigate some, bugs or crashes or things like that, which, as is part of the responsibilities of, any developers, there is at the moment not really a lot of Rust involved because as I mentioned, we only started having Rust code in the Codebase like a few weeks ago, and they're currently kind of building blocks for things that isn't currently for a feature that isn't currently fully implemented and therefore isn't fully used in Thunderbird. But I have to deal with a bit of JavaScript and a bit of C++ depending on the area of the code base that I'm working through.
At least you need to understand basic building blocks and how those things work together to work on Exchange support.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the first steps in that Exchange project has been basically trying to figure out, we don't know how to build a protocol in Thunderbird, how to build support for a new protocol in Thunderbird. Let's have a look at what already exists. And so I think it was back in September, I spent 2-3 weeks kind of going through the implementation of IMAP in Thunderbird, which is written entirely in C++. So there was a lot of, diving into C++ code, figuring out what it does, figuring out how every block fits together.
Maybe before we dive into Exchange support, let's give our listeners some context. How big is the Thunderbird code base? Do you have any numbers, any statistics around that? And also, what protocols are supported?
Yeah, so at the moment, in terms of support for mail protocols, we have, your standards IMAP, PUB3, SMTP. There's also an NTP for, newsgroups /Usenets, which also exists. We also have, so Thunderbird also has a whole instant messaging module, but that's kind of a separated part of the code base. In terms of lines of code, at the moment, if you accumulate the C++, the JavaScript, and the Rust, you come to about 585,000 lines of code. If you remove everything but, mail and newsgroups and things like that, you come down to 475,000 thereabouts. So, bit of a drop, but still a lot. A significant amount of that is C++. A big amount as well is JavaScript. One of the reasons is the front end, currently the UI of Thunderbird is mostly made of, web technologies. So JavaScript, CSS, HTML, or XUL in the oldest parts of the application. So, and currently we don't have a good separation between front end and back end in Thunderbird. That's kind of one of the things that Rust might help us with in the future. But we currently, so it's difficult at the moment to figure out, which of these JavaScript is doing more front-endy bits, what is doing more kind of intermediate / backendy bits. Yeah. And in those almost 500,000 lines of code, there's about 500, a bit over 500 lines, which are Rust at the moment. So kind of to demonstrating that we're definitely very early stages at the moment.
Okay, so we set the stage for integrating Exchange support. First off, I wonder, why is Exchange so important for the Thunderbird users? Is it an often requested feature?
Yeah, it's actually one of the most requested features on Thunderbirds. It's the thing that you often find with Exchange is the people who are using it are usually not the people who made the decision that they had to use it, because usually you find Exchange in universities, in companies, in those kind of in the workplace, and most users don't have the authorization or power to just change a critical part of their workplace infrastructure. So a lot of, there are compatibility layers that exist and that are provided by Microsoft with, IMAP, SMTP, and so on. But they're very often, at least in a lot of workplaces, they're disabled. I'm not entirely sure about that. I think Microsoft is usually kind of pushing for those to be disabled, and under some sort of, I think, security argument. I can't remember the specifics. And so that means that a lot of users have no real possibility of using, more open standards and protocols to consume their work emails.
And I guess the alternative to using Thunderbird in this case would be to use Office 365.
Yeah, Outlook, etc.
Outlook, yeah.
And it was actually a bit controversial at first. There were some discussions about, and a bit of pushback, not a lot of it, but on whether Thunderbird should implement Exchange at all, because Thunderbird is and has been a big advocate for open standards, and so it feels a bit counterproductive and a bit going against that to suddenly implement Microsoft's proprietary protocol right into the app. But the reality of the situation is, Thunderbird is currently not, doesn't have enough influence, market share, etc., to be able to influence Microsoft, obviously. We can't rock up to Microsoft Office and say, our users aren't happy, you have to enable IMAP for every account. That's just not something that's realistic at the moment. And so with that in mind, if we keep, pushing back again, like if we keep arguing about keeping that status of like restricting protocols to only open standards, the user is the one that's being punished in the end, and is the one that would like to use Thunderbird but just can't, because Thunderbird doesn't want to support them, and their workplace doesn't want to support Thunderbirds. And I would say that I would personally say that being in this kind of situations, adding support for something proprietary such as Microsoft Exchange, although it would be obviously better if that wasn't something that was so needed, it's actually helping, I think, Thunderbird advocate for open standards, because then you enable users to use Thunderbird to have their work email, but also their personal email, their emails that they might have, mailboxes that they might have with other organizations, etc., to have them all in one app, which is Thunderbird. And those, other mailboxes are likely based on open standards in terms of, communications and with the server and all this.
Is that the first open implementation of the Exchange protocol that you know of?
No. So there's currently at least one other open source email client that implements support for Microsoft Exchange, which is Evolution. And we've actually, in the kind of early stages of the project, kind of looked a lot of at what Evolution does, and worked a bit as well with some of the maintainers of the EWS add-on EWS being the specific protocol for Exchange that we're implementing, that add-on for Evolution.
And walk us through a typical day. Do you sit down and then you look at the spec, you look at the Evolution code, and then you try to model what you see in Rust? Do you work on the domain model right now? And how do you deal with making this as idiomatic as possible in Rust?
So at the moment, it's not really something that I'm working a lot with. My focus for the past couple of months has been more oriented towards code infrastructure. So when we started looking at what we needed to be able to implement Rust in Thunderbird, we realized currently XPCOM, which is the only way we can interact with something like the networking component of Firefox/Thunderbird, is not very idiomatic for Rust, because it uses, obviously that component is written in C++, and obviously C++ doesn't have nice stuff like asynchronous and async await syntax and that kind of niceties. So one of my first areas of focus has been to implement some kind of translation layer to first enable asynchronous codes. Well, asynchronous code to be run with the native async await syntax in Rust, and then to build on top of that to kind of expose a nicer at least and more idiomatic HTTP client in Rust, which is kind of based on, inspired by the request crate, but isn't obviously a one-to-one mapping. There's some demos and links in the page for a first dem talk that we did a few weeks ago on specifically Rust in Thunderbird, which is called Thunderbird: How to Exchange RUD for Rust, which is a fantastic pun that Ike, one of my coworkers, came up with kind of on the spot when we were brainstorming names. And there's a couple demos during the talk, and in the same page there's a few links to the source code of those crates. And so at the moment I'm taking a bit of very, very short and temporary kind of step back from Rust to kind of explore how to hook Exchange into the account setup feature of Thunderbird. So I'm assuming that once I'm out of exploration phase and I start prototyping and actually implementing, I'll come back to Rust. But yeah, at the moment it's more exploratory.
What was the decision not to use request directly and instead write something else?
So, I mean, it's true that we could have used request directly. However, because Thunderbird already has a fairly feature complete networking stack that it's borrowing from Firefox, which is called Neko, and has existed for the past 20-25 years as well. and is hooked into, all the nice things like DevTools and the network inspector and things like that. It didn't feel, it felt a bit sad to just ignore that and use a completely different HTTP stack. And it also felt like it wouldn't lead to the most maintainable code. Let's imagine you're tracking a bug in that implementation, and suddenly you can't use all of the nice network debugging tools that the whole rest of the code base uses. And so, we decided to, instead of using something that already exists like request, to instead try to build an interface that resembles request, but under the hood uses that networking component.
Did you already catch any bugs in the C++ code ever since you started integrating Rust?
I don't know if I would call them bugs. I have definitely noticed a few kind of weird behaviors that can be identified, such as, when you're building your HTTP request, you need to set the methods sometimes you need to set the method after you set the body of the request, because the component under the hood, like the part of Neko under the hood that's going to build your request, might try to infer what method to use depending on the content of that body, because it has some backwards compatibility with some previous versions of the interface that it uses, which is something that I don't know if it's, I would say it's more, complexity that is inherent with maintaining a complex 20 plus years old code base than actually bugs. But it is definitely something that felt a bit unexpected, but wasn't necessarily difficult to work around.
Are there any specific libraries or crates from the Rust ecosystem that you could leverage and use for Thunderbird, or did you literally have to build everything from scratch?
No, there are a few things that things that we're using. I know we're, especially around so EWS, which is the protocol for Exchange that we're currently implementing.
That's for Exchange Web Service?
Yeah. And so that protocol is XML over HTTP. The HTTP parts, because it's, network based, we kind of decided to do our own thing. The XML parts, we started by looking at the ecosystem, because that's something that because there's a lot there that we can just reuse. Ultimately, we decided that for the serialization side of things, because of some strictness around SERDE's data model, it doesn't work well enough with XML, with the kind of structures that you find in XML for what we want to do. And so for serialization, we did end up implementing our own derived macros and so on. For deserialization, we are using, if I remember correctly, we're using a SERD implementation based on QuickXML. And also that serialization crate is also based on QuickXML. So there's, a bunch of there's a bunch of existing crates that we're using, and we also hope to contribute to that ecosystem through the work that we're doing currently. So, all the XML serialization that we're working on, and even at a higher level, the Exchange support that we're working on. We're trying to design those so that we can ultimately have them as separate crates that people can just reuse.
Does that mean you use two different crates for XML serialization and deserialization? You mentioned quick XML for deserialization, I guess, and a custom version for serialization then?
Yeah, we start initially. Ideally, we would just use everything. We would just use the same crate for both. The issue with serialization is the current crates said is support for those crates, versions of those crates have a few issues, which is that, in XML you have namespaces on your XML tags, and those tags can also have attributes which are different from their values and things like that.
Right.
In order to support to generate XML that has the right namespaces and attributes, we realized that we needed our own thing, because the existing tools and crates within the ecosystem either didn't support correctly, for example, setting a namespace on a tag, for example, or would support setting namespaces and attributes, but with a lot of boilerplates, which, for a small XML API wouldn't necessarily be that much of an issue. But the AWS protocol has, I think from memory, about 100 different operations, 1,600 or 1,700 different data structures. And so the smallest amount of boilerplates that we can eliminate is a huge win for the overall, maintainability of the whole thing. So that's why we've kind of looked at having our own thing for serialization, because we do need to have our requests being formatted in a very specific way. For the responses, we don't necessarily need to have to be that strict, because ultimately in the response there might be some data that we don't need, or that that we can be a bit more flexible about. For deserialization, we can just reuse a lot of what already exists in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I can imagine that it must be a nightmare to run integration tests against the Exchange protocol. Do you plan to have some sort of end-to-end test that you can run locally? How do you track regressions, and how do you make sure that you implement the protocol correctly?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that's is very much on our mind, but we don't really have a good answer to just yet. I think ultimately we would like to have like a automated end-to-end tests. For now, all of our end-to-end testing is done kind of manually, because nowadays you can just use a hotmail.com email address to send AWS requests to. So that's not too difficult, but also obviously not that future-proof. So it is something that we'll need to figure out in the coming month. But yeah, that's going to be possibly a tricky bit.
Yeah, there are tools for this which allow you to record HTTP requests, and you can replay them over and over again until you get it right. But at the same time, it doesn't really help you that much, because the things that you record are the things that you know about. And the question is what comes after.
I mean, ideally, we would have, a full-fledged Exchange server running in CI, and we could just send requests to it and see, if the actual implementation does the thing that we expect it to do. It's not clear yet whether that's something that we'll be able to do, or whether we'll need to go another route. We'll see.
Maybe you eventually need to build a mock Exchange server. Fake change. I don't know.
That's a good name idea. I'll keep it in mind if we need to go there. I mean, I know there's also a couple open source AWS implementations out there, server implementations out there. So maybe that could be an alternative. Yeah, well, it's something that's we'll definitely need to look into.
I asked a few engineering friends what would be the things that Thunderbird could use Rust for in Thunderbird. And it was surprising because people almost anonymously said for search and for plugins. For search, because sometimes, apparently, search doesn't work, or at least there were some edge cases. And for plugins, because so far you can only write plugins in JavaScript, I guess, and it would be nice to have WebAssembly support and write plugins in Rust. What do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting prospect to consider. At the moment, I'm not entirely sure whether that's the route we want to go, because on the search side of things, like rewriting search entirely in Rust would be a kind of huge undertaking, and it's not even clear yet what that would look like in the future, because we're also doing a lot of work around reworking, the storage layer of Thunderbirds and so on. It might be the case that in a few years we decide to rewrite part or the entirety of the feature in Rust, but that's not really on the horizon just yet. In terms of add-ons / extensions, I mean, I'll preface by saying that I'm definitely not the best person to talk about add-ons. We have one of my coworkers, John, is actually working full-time on taking care of the add-on ecosystem and implementing new APIs and things like that. I know that I think I've heard at first that obviously, I mean, don't take my word for it, that a recent version of Firefox has added support for embedding some Rust into add-ons. That might be something that we'll want to also support in Thunderbird. I don't know the specific details. If anyone's interested in getting more information or kind of contributing to that effort, feel free to go on thunderbird.net, find our community channels and reach out to the Thunderbird add-ons community, which would probably be happy to help in that area.
When we started the conversation, we established that you have a background in many languages, including Go and Rust. Can you briefly contrast the development experience in both languages?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't done any Go in almost a year, so it's still it's kind of starting to fade a bit. I would say that there are some things that I think where Rust is nicer than Go. Obviously, memory management is one of them, and I think also in the area of error handling, like not having to just return error at every single place you could ever get an error. Whereas Rust has a result, and you can just if you don't really care about doing your error handling at a specific part of the code, you just question mark it and you're done with it. I think one area where Go is a bit nicer than Rust is with its standard library. And I'm not saying that Rust standard library is not good or is designed poorly or whatever. I don't think that's the case. I just think that Rust is still a fairly young platform. I mean, it's about, I think, 12 years old now, but it's only started, booming and and getting used more widely, maybe 5-6 years ago. And that's kind of ramping up. Like I think I remember reading not too long ago that Microsoft was starting to invest into rewriting some parts of Windows in Rust, which is super cool to see. But the standard library in Rust still feels a bit young, I think, especially like I'll use a couple examples. We looked at the current kind of state of sending HTTP traffic in Go, and how we can make our current work interoperable. Like having a Rust crate that is specific to Exchange, that's an external crate, and you give it like an HTTP client that's either the one from Thunderbird or request or something else that, I don't know, Thunderbird for Android when it comes around might want to use. And there's not really, and at the moment, there's not really a solution to that. There are third-party crates that implement some types for HTTP. Like there's I think the most widely known and used is the HTTP crate that's maintained by the Hyper project. But if you're not, but the way those crates are built, doesn't mean that, well, it means that any interoperability that you might that you would get is, only if the crates, only if your two clients were using those exact same times, for example, for the same time for a request, the same time for a response. And, I could be wrong, but I know that request uses some of the types from that crate, but like,
yes.
methods and status codes, but, request response types, it's their own types. And the way those crates, the way those types are defined, they're defined as struct, not really as traits, which means that you can't really have your own logic in the specific implementation of each methods of that type. And I'm kind of circling back to standards, to the standard library, because obviously the HTTP crate is not part of the standard library. But it would be nice, I think, and potentially necessary in the future to have to kind of standardize, to have a more standardized approach to those kind of operations, like sending an HTTP request, or, even serialization and deserialization. Like Serdi is one of the major players in the Rust ecosystem, to the point where I think it's even mentioned in the official API guidelines for Rust. But it's still technically a third-party crate, and it's only a de facto standards. And I think there's, room for more, for better and more flexible standardization within the standard library that other platforms like I think Node or, Go might have, that I think would benefit Rust.
On the other side, one could argue that having all of these crates outside of the standard library helped make them more mature. We can look at error handling, for example. If we decided on a standard like error chain before, that's pretty much what we would be stuck with right now. But this error and anyhow might arguably be better or have better abstractions because they came later in Rust's, life cycle, and they used better abstractions like derives, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the maintainers of the standard library should just take the top 5 most used crates in the ecosystem and just integrate them. I'm not saying that it might make more sense, that it might make the most sense for Rust to standardize all of those aspects now. I I think my point was more that it's, one of the downsides of picking an ecosystem that is still maturing and maybe hasn't reached the same stage as other languages, that you might be lacking in some operations might be a bit more difficult to achieve because there's less support for it in the standard library. Hopefully that will come in the future, and I think the future for Rust is quite bright. That's kind of a point of comparison between Rust and other platforms.
Since you started working on Thunderbird, what have you learned about Rust? Maybe not about Rust the language, more about Rust the ecosystem, or things that were not as clear before as they are now, that you use it in production as a driver for a quite big project.
I mean, me personally, I definitely, using Rust in like the Exchange implementation project was my first time using Rust on a kind of bigger scale than just slowly prototyping and getting frustrated at the compiler. And being in a context where I could experiment a bit more with the platform and do cool things with it, really made me appreciate, like, basically understand why so many people like Rust. Because sure, it's frustrating when you start working with Rust, because it feels like even the simplest program takes hours to build, which and so that's kind of worsens the learning curve of Rust, which I was talking about that with someone from the Rust Foundation last week, who told me that apparently they even have a term for it, which is the Rust hump. But as you progress in your getting used to Rust and getting used to all those new concepts that come with it, you come to really appreciate the fact that if once your code builds, you show that you have a certain standard in terms of safety, in terms of quality, and that you have a nice and more maintainable and less error prone outputs from that. And it also kind of makes you reconsider your relation with the compiler itself, because in other compiled languages, the compiler is just something that turns code into binary. In Rust, the compiler is that, but also kind of a bit sort of an advisor in, if you do this, you're going to, if I let you do this, you're going to run into those kind of issues in the future. So yeah, I think it's definitely things that I didn't necessarily think about before when I thought about Rust.
Based on the experience you have now, what advice would you give to other projects considering Rust for bigger systems, maybe systems that were written in C++ and have existed for a while? What are the sort of requirements for success, and what is necessary to kick off such a project?
I would say that definitely use Rust when it makes sense. I think there are a lot of use cases where Rust makes sense, when you need that memory safety, when you need those performances and so on. There are also cases where you might prefer, like, it might make more sense to use a different language. Programming language is a tool, and the programming language ecosystem is a toolbox, and you choose what fits most with with the tool that fits best with the work that you need to do. So definitely consider that, ask yourself those kind of questions first. invest in training your engineers to be good Rust developers, because that might take more time than, let's say, Go, for example. If Rust is the good fit for your project, definitely invest in training the people who are going to work on it, because it's going to pay off in the future. But that initial investment is necessary, I would say. And yeah, I think those are the two main aspects. I think I would say.
And lastly, it has become somewhat of a tradition around here to ask a very specific final question. Mm-hmm. And that is, what would be your message to the Rust community as a whole? Anything you have in mind, could be literally whatever comes to mind. Do you have a message to the Rust community?
I would say that Rust is a very cool project, a very cool language. It has a lot of features and aspects that are very unique to Rust. And yeah, I'm looking forward to write more Rust code in the future. I'm looking forward to learn more about Rust and its ecosystem, and I'm looking forward to see what improvements and changes Rust gets in the future, because I think the future is very bright for Rust.
Brendan, it has been an honor to talk to you today.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I will keep using Thunderbird and keep on doing the great work that you do. And also, for all the listeners that use Thunderbird, maybe consider donating.
Absolutely, yeah. As I mentioned, Thunderbird at the moment is entirely donations funded. We're exploring some areas to kind of diversify that revenues, all sources of revenue, but donations are still going to be an important part in funding the work that goes into developing, maintaining, improving Thunderbirds. So we're infinitely grateful for everyone who uses Thunderbird and everyone who donates to keep the project alive.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you.
Rust in Production is a podcast by Corode and hosted by me, Matthias Endler. For show notes, transcripts, and to learn more about how I can help your company make the most of Rust, visit corode.dev. Thanks for listening to Rust in Production.